At his ranch, Caleb Flint's, where only the echo of the past reigned, 5 Apache widows with children knocked, bringing with them not only despair, but also a challenge to his ingrained prejudices. After all, the world of the Wild West was cruel. The locals and old, soulless laws saw in them only enemies, ready to once again ignite the flame of conflict. But no one expected that the heart of the Lone Ranger, hardened by loss, would falter, and fate would send an unexpected guardian angel who would turn all foundations upside down. Get ready for a story where compassion breaks through hatred and justice takes on the most unexpected face. Subscribe, like, and watch until the end, because the denouement of this story is truly shocking, and at the end you will find an important conclusion, comparable to the modern world, which will teach wisdom. The hot Arizona sun of 1880 spared no one, but for Caleb Flint, owner of the Lone Oak Ranch, its rays were a familiar companion. Caleb, a rugged man of 45, with a tan face crisscrossed with a network of wrinkles and steely gray eyes, was the embodiment of the harsh West. His broad-shouldered figure, always clad in a dusty leather vest and a faded blue shirt, seemed carved from granite. He was a man of his word, but he spoke those words very little, preferring actions to empty chatter. His ranch, located on the edge of the vast territory known as the Valley of Tears, was his only family, his refuge from a world that had once taken everything from him. Caleb's eyes always held a wariness, a legacy of long-ago losses and the struggle for survival in the relentless prairies. Caleb's motivation was simple and harsh: to save his ranch, the only thing he had left after the tragedy that happened many years ago. A bandit raid took the lives of his wife and young daughter, leaving an unhealing wound and a deep distrust of all strangers in his heart, especially towards those who even remotely resembled Indians, although he understood that the culprits were white thugs. But grief often distorts memory, and prejudice took root in his soul. Since then, he lived in strict solitude, raising cattle, repairing fences, and fending off rare vagrants and predators. His only companions were his old dog Barney and his faithful horse Rambo. One sweltering August afternoon, as Caleb was mending a leaky fence on the western border of his property, an unusual rustle caught his attention. It wasn't the wind, not an animal, something else, more meaningful. Caleb's hand instinctively rested on the handle of his old but reliable Winchester, which was always hanging on his saddle. He slowly turned, his eyes scanning the horizon, ready for any danger. He expected to see a coyote, or perhaps a stray cowboy, but what he saw made his heart clench with surprise. Right in front of his ranch, on the dusty road, stood 5 women. They were Apache. Their clothes, once bright, were now torn and covered in road dust. Their faces were haggard, their eyes showed fatigue and deep sorrow, but at the same time, they held themselves with extraordinary dignity. One of them, an elderly woman with gray strands in her black hair, held a small child in her arms who was quietly sobbing. Another, a young woman with eyes full of despair, hugged two little ones tightly. 3 more women, older, stood behind, their gazes directed at Caleb with wariness and some strange, frightening determination. They were exhausted. Their bodies, thin and fragile, seemed as if they could collapse at any moment. But in their postures, in their eyes, there was something unshakable. They did not ask, they demanded, though without words. Caleb, who saw a potential threat in every Indian, felt his long-held prejudices come alive. What do they need? Why are they here? What do they want? These questions swirled through his head, mixing with old pain and fear. The elderly woman, apparently their leader, took a step forward. Her face, etched with wrinkles, was stern, but in her eyes, the color of obsidian, Caleb saw something he couldn't explain. She raised her hand, showing an empty water skin, then pressed it to her stomach, pointing to the children. Her voice was quiet, but it rang out clearly, albeit in a foreign language. We lost our husbands. The tribe is gone. We need water. Food. Caleb stood silently, his finger involuntarily finding the trigger. 5 Apache widows, without men, left to die. It was unheard of, unusual, and caused in him not only caution, but also deep shock. His mind, accustomed to the simple order of the Wild West, could not comprehend this picture. He saw in them not only a potential threat, but also something that caused him acute compassion, mixed with hatred for the injustice he had once experienced himself. 2 forces fought in his mind, the instinct for self-preservation and a long-forgotten human compassion. Go away, Caleb said, his voice hoarse. He didn't want them here. Didn't want the problems they could bring. But the women didn't move. Their gazes, full of resilience and supplication, were fixed on him, on his ranch, as if it were their last refuge. They weren't leaving. The young woman, hugging her children, took another step forward. Her eyes, full of tears, met his gaze. "My children are dying, please." She fell to her knees, dust rising around her. This was not pretense, not cunning. This was true, unbearable despair. At that moment, something in Caleb wavered. His hand dropped from the Winchester. He hated Indians, but he couldn't watch children die. It was beyond his strength, beyond his prejudices. It was beyond that old, broken Caleb. He gritted his teeth. He couldn't abandon them, couldn't deny help to the children. It was a deep injustice that this woman was suffering from, and Caleb, who had himself experienced the loss of his family, felt her pain. Caleb's decision to let the Apache widows onto his ranch was an unwelcome compromise between his hardened heart and the remnants of his conscience. He gritted his teeth as he gestured for them to follow him. 5 haggard figures, like shadows, moved towards his house. Old dog Barney, who had been quietly dozing on the porch, raised his head. His fur bristled, and a low growl revealed his distrust of the strangers. Caleb felt the same, but the sight of the hungry children silenced his inner protests. "There's water in the well. Food. I'll find it," Caleb grumbled hoarsely, pointing to an old building that once served as a barn. It was the only place where they could temporarily settle, away from his own house. He didn't want them to close. His house was his fortress, his only sanctuary. The women moved towards the well. Their movements were slow, but purposeful. The elderly woman, who, as it turned out later, was named Nasiva, was the first to lower the bucket into the deep well. The water, raised from the depths of the earth, was cool and clean. The children, exhausted by the heat and thirst, drank greedily, clinging to their mother's hands. The young woman, Ahono, with expressive eyes, did not take her gaze off Caleb, as if trying to read his thoughts. Her 2 little ones, a boy and a girl, were too weak to play. They just clung to her skirts, their little eyes warily scanning the unfamiliar place. The other 3 women, Chivo, Kaya, and Akal, began to cautiously inspect the barn. Their movements were fast and practical, evaluating every crack and every corner. Caleb, watching them, felt a strange mixture of resentment and anxiety. He, a man who barely tolerated one person in his house, now harbored 5 women and 3 children. It was madness. He went into his house. His gaze slid over the meager food supplies, a bag of beans, some dried meat, cornmeal. It was barely enough for him, but he couldn't refuse them. A few minutes later, he returned with a bundle of blankets and a couple of old sacks that could serve as mattresses. "Settle in. I'll make something to eat," he mumbled, avoiding their gazes. Nasiva nodded. Something resembling restrained gratitude flickered in her eyes. When Caleb lit a small fire near the barn, Ahono approached him. Her voice was quiet, but firm, although with a strong accent. "We are not used to receiving. We can work." She pointed to the dry branches lying nearby. "Firewood. We will bring it." Caleb froze for a moment. Indian women were offering to work. It was unexpected. His prejudices suggested that they would rather sit back, waiting for handouts. But he saw the determination in her eyes. "All right," he replied, pointing to the axe. "But be careful." Ahoma and Chiva, despite their fatigue, immediately set to work, cleverly gathering dry branches and chopping them with a small axe. Caleb, watching them, felt a barely noticeable intrigue arise in his soul. These women were not what he had expected. They were resilient, resourceful, and clearly not going to be helpless. The evening passed in tense silence. Caleb prepared a stew of beans and dried meat, which they ate by the fire. The children, having received food and water, looked a little better, but their gaze was still wary. Nasiva, sitting opposite Caleb, studied him with unconcealed interest. She saw in him not only the owner of the ranch, but also a man whose soul was wounded. The next morning, when the sun had just begun to rise above the horizon, Caleb found that the women were already awake. They were quietly and organizedly going about their business. Ahoma and Kaya were preparing a meager breakfast from the leftover stew. Akal was combing her daughter's long black hair, and Nasiva seemed to just sit, observing the world around her. Her gaze was deep and insightful. Caleb was about to go check on the herd when Nasiva approached him. Her face was serious. "The herd is sick. We saw tracks not far." She pointed to the east, towards the hills where his cows were grazing. There was no panic in her voice, only a statement of fact. Caleb frowned. Cattle disease was a serious threat to his ranch. He was going to check it himself, but Nasiva's words made him even more alert. How could she know? He hadn't told her about it. What did you see? Caleb asked, his voice suspicious. Nasiva shook her head. Her eyes were serious. The land speaks. The water smells. We know. She didn't give direct answers, only mysterious hints that only deepened the intrigue. Caleb didn't understand how these women, who had just come from the desert, could know about the condition of his herd. He saddled Rambo and headed east. What he saw confirmed Nasiva's words. Several of his cows lay, exhausted, their flanks heaving heavily. The water in the small stream from which they drank seemed murky, and it gave off a strange, metallic smell. A disease, perhaps the plague. It was terrible. The ranch was under threat. Returning, Caleb found Nasiva near the barn. She was waiting for him. Her gaze was calm, neat. To find clean water, and take the herd away. Quickly, Caleb looked at her, his distrust fighting with the understanding that these women might know something he didn't. In their words, in their actions, a secret was hidden that he had yet to unravel. He, a man who always relied only on himself, now found himself in a situation where his survival, and the survival of his ranch, depended on 5 Apache widows who appeared on his doorstep like ghosts from the past. Returning to the ranch, Caleb felt like a cornered animal. The clean water source he had found gave hope, but it was too far to quickly save the dying herd. The air around the corrals was heavy with the smell of sickness and grief. Every moan of an animal echoed with pain in his heart. It wasn't just the loss of cattle, it was the loss of the meaning of his life, the last bastion of his shattered world. A deep sadness enveloped him, pressing him to the ground like a lead blanket. He, the resilient Caleb Flint, was almost broken by the weight of this misfortune. The Apache women met him near the barn. Nasiva, with her wise eyes, immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Ahona held her children tighter, their small faces reflecting a growing fear. The herd is dying, Caleb said quietly, his voice hoarse. Even if we find a way to drive them to that water, many won't make it. He looked at Nasiva, his eyes showing the despair he had hidden for so long. What do I do? This is the end. Nasiva stepped closer. Her hand, wrinkled and strong, rested on his forearm. There was no timidity in her touch, only ancient wisdom. Not the end. My people, no herbs, for healing, and for water. We can bring them. She pointed to the distant hills where rare, but known to her, plants grew. Caleb raised his eyebrows in surprise. Herbs, he, like most white settlers, regarded Indian medicine with contempt. But now, when traditional treatments were useless and time was running out, his despair began to erode his prejudices. You can cure them? Caleb didn't believe his ears. Ahona stepped forward. I know. My mother taught me. In her eyes, despite her fatigue, determination burned. She was young, but there was a strength in her, inherited from her ancestors. Caleb realized he had no choice. This was the only chance, however incredible it seemed. All right, he said. His voice was firm, although he still had internal doubts. Show me. I'll go with you. The next morning, before dawn, Caleb, Nasiva, Ahona, and Shiva went into the mountains. Kaya and Akal stayed at the ranch with the children. The path was long and dangerous, leading through rocky slopes and deep ravines. Nasiva and Ahona moved nimbly along the familiar trails, their eyes fixed on the ground, searching for the right plants. They pointed to unassuming-looking herbs, talking about their properties in their own language, which Caleb didn't understand, but in the intonations of which he felt a deep respect for nature. When the sun reached its zenith, they stopped near a small crevice, where lush, at first glance, weeds grew. Ahona bent down, her fingers quickly and skillfully collecting leaves and roots, putting them in a leather bag. Nasiva, meanwhile, was inspecting a small spring seeping from a rock. This is strong water. With the power of the earth, she said, scooping the clear liquid with her hand. It will also help. Caleb watched them, his intrigue growing with every moment. Their knowledge was deep and accurate. They weren't just gathering herbs, they were interacting with the earth, understanding its hidden rhythms and secrets. This was something more than just medicine, it was a philosophy, a way of life, completely alien to him. However, on the way back, a new danger awaited them. As they descended a steep slope, A piercing cry rang out. From above, from behind a pile of rocks, huge boulders rolled towards them. "Rock slide!" Caleb shouted, pushing Ahona and Chiva aside. While trying to dodge himself, the boulders rolled past, raising clouds of dust and leaving destruction in their wake. When the dust settled, Caleb saw that Chiva was lying on the ground, her leg pinned between two rocks. Her face was pale with pain, but she didn't make a sound. "Chiva!" Ahona shouted, rushing to her. Caleb rushed to help, his heart clenched with horror. It was his fault. He brought them here, and now one of them was injured. The sadness washed over him again, but now it was mixed with guilt and a growing anger at the relentless Ust, which was constantly challenging him. He quickly assessed the situation. Chiva was seriously injured, and carrying her back to the ranch would be extremely difficult. Nasiva approached Chiva. Her eyes were full of grief, but an unyielding determination also burned in them. She quickly examined the leg, then looked at Caleb. "We must carry her. Otherwise," she didn't finish, but the meaning was clear. Caleb nodded. He knew it would be a long and agonizing journey. He lifted Chiva into his arms. Her body was light, but the pain reflected in her eyes was a heavy burden. They started back, but now their path was even slower and more dangerous. Caleb felt his strength leaving him, but he couldn't give up. The injured animals, the injured woman, they all depended on him. He looked at Nasiva and Ahona, who were supporting Chiva. Their faces were exhausted, but their determination did not waver. In their eyes, he saw not only their own grief, but also a deep solidarity that was beginning to change his perception of them. The long and agonizing journey back to the ranch turned out to be the most difficult test. Caleb, carrying Chiva's lifeless body in his arms, felt every step resonate with pain in his exhausted muscles. His shoulders were burning, and his breathing was staggered, but he couldn't stop. He saw the frightened faces of Ahona and Nasiva in front of him, who were supporting him. Their eyes were full of grief for their injured sister, but their determination did not waver. The sun beat down mercilessly, and every grain of sand raised by the wind seemed like a sharp needle. The pain he felt was not only physical, it was tinged with deep sadness and guilt for having subjected them to such danger. When they finally reached the ranch, Barney greeted them with a low, anxious howl. Kaya and Akil rushed to meet them, their faces distorted with horror at the sight of Chiva. The children, sitting near the barn, began to cry quietly, sensing the approaching trouble. "Put her here," Nasiva said, pointing to a clean spot in the barn where blankets had already been spread out. Her voice was quiet, but it contained a command that Caleb obeyed without question. Caleb carefully lowered Chiva to the ground. Her leg was swollen and bruised. Ahona quickly prepared a decoction of the gathered herbs, and Nasiva began to examine the wound. Her fingers, despite her age, were nimble and confident. She quietly mumbled something in her language, as if addressing spirits. Caleb stepped aside, his hands trembling. He felt helpless, redundant. His whole life was built on self-sufficiency, on him dealing with all problems on his own. But now he stood before them, powerless, watching these women, whom he barely knew, take responsibility for their sister's life. It was a shock that began to break down his old perceptions of the world. Compassion for Chiva, for her pain, for her children, who were now clinging to Kai and Akil, overwhelmed him. While Nasiva and Ahona were busy with Chiva, Caleb went to the sick house. The sight of the animals, exhausted and suffering, intensified his despair. Some were already lying motionless, their eyes dull and lifeless. Caleb, stooping, stroked one of the cows on its rough side, feeling its fever. He knew he was losing them, every single one. This thought caused him a bitter despair that threatened to consume him entirely. However, when he returned to the barn, his attention was drawn to an unusual activity. Ahona, despite her fatigue, was already grinding herbs with a small amount of clean water, and Chiva, although lying down, had her eyes open and was trying to say something to Nasiva. Nasiva, in turn, was applying a compress of leaves and clay to the wound. It seemed that life was slowly but surely returning to her body. "She will live," Nasiva said quietly, noticing Caleb's gaze. Her voice held an unyielding confidence that surprised him. "But she needs time and your help. A lot of work." She pointed to the bags of herbs. "And for the herd, too." Caleb nodded. He saw that Chiva's breathing was more even, a miracle, or ancient knowledge that he, a white man, had always despised. The intrigue surrounding these women deepened with each new manifestation of their unusual abilities. He began to understand that they possessed knowledge he hadn't even suspected, knowledge passed down for thousands of years from generation to generation. The next day, a real battle for lives began. The women, divided, worked tirelessly. Ahona and Chiva, despite her injury, helped her by preparing decoctions and compresses to apply to the sick animals. Nasiva, with her incredible endurance, constantly checked the state of the herd. Her eyes were everywhere. Kaya and Akal took care of the children, keeping the fire and preparing food. Caleb, who had initially doubted, now worked alongside them, carrying water, helping to move the animals, following their instructions. He saw how they communicated with the animals, as if understanding their pain, their needs. Despite all their efforts, some cows still die. Caleb felt his heart clench with each new loss. It was painful. It was hard. He stood over the animal carcasses, feeling devastated. However, watching the women, he noticed something amazing. They did not give up. They continued to fight for every single one who was still breathing. Their faces were grim, but stubborn hope burned in their eyes. One evening, as the sun was setting, Caleb noticed that one of his oldest and most valuable cows, which he considered lost, began to slowly get to its feet. Its eyes, which had recently been cloudy, were now clear. It took a few uncertain steps, and then began to eat grass. It was a true revelation for Caleb. He realized that these women, these Apache widows, had brought him not only problems, but also a salvation he could not find himself. They began to revive not only his herd, but also his belief that the world could be different. The morning after the old cow got to its feet, the Lone Oak Ranch was filled with a new, subtle hope. Caleb, usually sullen and withdrawn, felt an amazing surge of strength. It was not just the relief of the animal's recovery, it was something more a quiet, but powerful revelation that had broken through the years of his loneliness and distrust. He looked at the Apache women, who were already in full swing with preparations for the new day, and now saw in them not a threat or a burden, but salvation. Ahona, with her thin but strong hands, ground new herbs on a stone, mixing them with water from the spring they had found the day before. Nasiva, sitting next to Chiva, quietly said something to her in her own language, stroking the heads of her daughters, who were now playing at the entrance to the barn. Their laughter, once unthinkable on this ranch, rang in the morning air. Chiva, though weak, was already sitting up. Her eyes were clear, and a faint smile appeared on her face. It was a miracle created by the hands of these women. Caleb approached Nasiva. For the first time in a long time, he felt neither irritation nor fear, only deep, respectful curiosity. "How do you do this?" he said. His voice was unusually soft. Nasiva looked up at him. Understanding was in her eyes. "The earth gives power. If you know how to listen, the herbs, they speak. The water, too." She held out a small root to him, smelling of freshness and earth. "For your herd, you need a lot." Quickly, Caleb nodded. He took the root, his fingers slightly trembling. Now he had no doubts. He completely trusted them. From that day on, a new order was established on the ranch. Caleb, forgetting his prejudices, fully joined in the work with the women. He hauled water, helped gather herbs, built new shelters for the sick animals, following their instructions. He saw how Nasiva, with the help of herbs and her ancient knowledge, healed the most hopeless cows, how Hona skillfully prepared decoctions, how Kai and Akal took care of the children, maintaining cleanliness and order. Watching them, Caleb began to understand something more than just Indian medicine. He saw their resilience, their perseverance, their deep connection to the earth and to each other. They were not just a group of women, they were a single whole, a family that shared sorrow and joy. Their motivation was simple: survival, protecting their children, preserving their traditions. And in this simplicity was an incredible power. He, a lonely ranger who had always shunned people, now felt part of something big and important. One day, as Caleb and Ahona were returning from the pasture where they were moving the recovering cows to a new water source, they heard a distant gunshot. The sound was alarming, too close to be a coincidence. Caleb immediately became alert, his hand instinctively resting on his holster. "What was that?" Ahona whispered, her eyes wide. "Maybe a hunter, or drifters," Caleb replied, his gaze scanning the horizon. He knew that in the Valley of Tears, there were always those who weren't afraid to take what wasn't theirs. Suddenly, a lone rider appeared from behind the mesquite bushes. It was a haggard, dirty man in tattered clothes. His face was gaunt, and his eyes burned with a feverish glint. In his hands, he held an old revolver. He was clearly one of those who had recently run the Valley of Tears looking for profit. He saw Caleb and Ahona, and a greedy smirk appeared on his face. "Well, cowboy," the drifter rasped, pointing the revolver at Ahona. "Looks like you found yourself a redskin girlfriend. Come on, honey, you'll have a lot more fun with me." Anger flared in Caleb. This was not just a drifter, he was a predator who was threatening those he now considered his own. His finger rested on the trigger. "Leave her, and get off my land." The drifter laughed. "You're alone, old man, and I'm hungry, and I need a woman." He took a step forward. His eyes were fixed on Ahona. At that moment, Ahona, without saying a word, pulled a small, sharp knife from her bosom. Her movements were fast and precise, like a wildcat's. The drifter didn't even have time to understand what had happened. The knife glinted in Ahona's hand, and she, without flinching, made a deep cut on his arm, causing him to drop the revolver. "I'm not a honey," Ahona hissed in her language, her eyes burning with fury. "I'm a warrior." Caleb, taken aback by the unexpectedness, immediately reacted. His Colt flew out of its holster, and one accurate shot made the drifter, howling with pain, run away. He didn't look back, disappearing behind the hills. Caleb looked at Ahona. Her face was pale, but such strength, such fury burned in her eyes that he felt admiration. He, who had always considered Indian women weak and submissive, now saw a warrior in her, capable of standing up for herself. You did well," Caleb said, his voice full of respect. Ahona just nodded, putting away the knife. She approached Caleb, and her hand, still trembling with adrenaline, touched his forearm. In that touch, there was no former wariness, only a deep, mutual trust that had grown between them, like seeds in dry soil. Caleb felt his heart, long closed to the world, now completely open to these women. He realized that his life, his ranch, would never be the same again. And it wasn't scary, but on the contrary inspiring. After the confrontation with the drifter, the atmosphere at the Lone Oak Ranch changed. All semblance of the former tension disappeared, giving way to a new, unspoken alliance. Caleb, who had previously shunned any contact, now felt his heart open up to these women. He saw in them not just Apaches, but resilient, wise companions, capable of enduring the hardships of a harsh life alongside him. His breakthrough was obvious. He not only accepted them, but also began to rely on their instincts and knowledge, seeing in this not weakness, but a new strength. The herd was gradually recovering. Under Nasiva's careful guidance, Ahona and Chiva continued to prepare healing decoctions, and Caleb, following their instructions, maintained hygiene in the corrals and provided the animals with fresh water. The children, recovering from hunger and hardship, once again ran around the yard. Their laughter was the sweetest music on this once so lonely ranch. Kaya and Akal took care of the household, turning a modest life into something cozy and organized. They built small awnings for shade, gathered berries, and wove simple rugs from improvised materials. Caleb learned more and more about them. Nasiva, the oldest, was a tribal healer who knew hundreds of herbs and ancient prayers. Her calmness and wisdom amazed Caleb. Ahona, the young mother, was incredibly resilient and a skilled hunter. Chiva, despite her injury, helped with everything. Her hands were accustomed to labor. Kaya and Akal, her sisters, were craftswomen, able to create things necessary for survival out of nothing. All of them were widows of warriors who died in a clash with white soldiers, and this was the reason for their wanderings. Their motivation was simple: to find a new place, a new life for themselves and their children. One evening, as they were all sitting by the fire, enjoying a rare moment of peace, Nasiva looked up at Caleb. Her gaze was serious. "We must leave," she said quietly. Caleb felt something clench in his chest. He didn't want them to leave. His ranch, his life, had been transformed with their arrival. He felt a pain of sadness at the very thought of their departure. "Why?" he asked. His voice was muffled. Nasiva pointed to the east. "Our people. They will be looking for us, and they will not understand." A white man, with Indian women. There was a deep anxiety in her words. She knew that tradition and prejudice were strong. Ahoma added, "They might think you kidnapped us. There will be a war." Caleb knew they were telling the truth. In this harsh world, Any deviation from customs could lead to bloodshed. His old prejudices, which he had almost overcome, now threatened to return in the form of a real threat. But where will you go? Caleb asked. You are defenseless. Nasiva shook her head. We are not defenseless. We have you and the land. At that moment, Caleb felt something new, a deep intrigue. What did they mean? They trusted him. They saw him as a protector, an ally. It was not just a promise. It was a new chapter in his life that he could not have foreseen. He couldn't let them go into the unknown, knowing that danger awaited them. And he couldn't let his ranch become the cause of a new war. He had to come up with something. The next day, Caleb woke up with a new determination. He knew he had to protect these women, even if it meant another confrontation with the world he had avoided for so long. He approached Nasiva. I won't let you go, Caleb said. His voice was firm. I will find a way for you to stay here, for you to be safe. We will come up with something. Nasiva looked at him, and a faint smile flickered in her eyes, which were usually so serious. It wasn't just an agreement, it was an acceptance. She saw that Caleb had changed, and that his decision was sincere. For several days, Caleb pondered. He knew that he couldn't just keep them on the ranch. The local authorities, if they found out, wouldn't understand. The Apache tribe, if they discovered them, wouldn't forgive them. He needed an official solution, a kind of cover. Suddenly, a thought struck him. He remembered an old law that was rarely used, but was still in force in these remote lands. A law about guardianship. He gathered the women and explained his plan to them. I will go to town, to Prescott, and try to register you as my workers, or something like that. Then no one can touch you. Ahona, hearing this, frowned. We are not slaves. No, of course not. Caleb shook his head. It's just a formality for the law, so that you are safe, so that no one dares to touch you. Nasiva listened carefully. Then she looked at the other women, said something to them quietly. After a short discussion, she nodded. We trust you, Caleb. We will go with you. Caleb was stunned. They not only agreed, but also decided to go with him. It was an act of incredible trust. He realized that their connection had become something much more than just a relationship between a host and guests. It was a family he never expected to find. The journey to Prescott was long and full of hardships, but now it felt different. Caleb rode ahead on Rambo, his Winchester at the ready. But behind him, instead of the usual emptiness, there were now 6 people, 5 Apache women and 3 children. They traveled from dawn to dusk, skillfully bypassing rocky trails and crossing small streams. Caleb, accustomed to solitude, now constantly listened to their quiet conversations, to the children's laughter, to the rustle of their steps. It was unusual, but at the same time wonderfully comforting. He found himself constantly turning back to make sure everyone was okay, his gaze lingering on Ahona, who was hugging her little ones tightly, or on Nasiva, whose wise eyes were always on alert. While Caleb was taking them, the women were not idle. Ahona, despite still limping, helped gather firewood, and Chiva, Kaya, and Akal were skilled gatherers of edible plants that Caleb hadn't even noticed. Their knowledge of the desert was invaluable, and Caleb listened to their advice more and more often, relying on their instincts. He began to see the world through their eyes, every crack in the ground, every flower, every animal track. It was a revelation, slowly but surely changing his inner world. On the 5th day of the journey, as they approached the outskirts of Prescott, the sight of the town, like a mirage, appeared in the distance. The wooden buildings, dusty streets, and clouds of smoke from the chimneys, all of this was a harbinger of the white man's world. A world that Caleb had once known, but from which he now felt distanced. Nasiva, noticing Caleb's tension, placed her hand on his shoulder. We are with you, Caleb, she said quietly. We trust you. At that moment, Caleb felt an unprecedented responsibility, but also incredible strength. However, as soon as they entered the town, their appearance caused a real commotion. 6 Apache women with children, accompanied by a lone white ranger. It was a sight that Prescott was not ready for. The locals, many of whom had themselves lost loved ones in clashes with Indians, instantly surrounded them, their faces distorted with anger and suspicion. Shouts were heard. What are these redskins? Get out of here. They will bring trouble. The women's children clung to their mothers, their eyes full of fear. Caleb dismounted, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver. "They are with me," he said firmly, his voice drowning out the crowd. "And they will not harm you." His gaze swept over the enraged faces of the townspeople, and he felt anger rising within him at their blind hatred. He saw in their eyes the same prejudices that he had fought within himself. At the nose, Sheriff Brody came out, a tall, sturdy man with a thick mustache and a badge on his chest. Sheriff Brody was known for his fairness, but also for his unwavering adherence to the law. "Flint, what's the meaning of this?" he asked. His gaze was stern. Caleb quickly explained the situation, trying to remain calm. He told them about the sick herd, about the women's help, about the bandits. Sheriff Brody listened to him carefully, his face remained impassive. Meanwhile, the women stood with their heads held high. Their dignity was unshakable, despite the hostility of the crowd. "Flint, you know the laws," the sheriff finally said. "Indians can't just live in a white man's town. Especially Apaches. I can't just leave them here. They need official status, and to get that is almost impossible." There was sadness in his voice, but the law was everything to him. Caleb felt the ground slip from under his feet. He knew this. He had foreseen this. But now, as he looked at the frightened eyes of the children, at the resilient but haggard faces of the women, his heart clenched with pain. Was it all for nothing? Was his attempt to protect them doomed? "I'm here to register them as my workers," Caleb said. His voice was tense. "They will work on my ranch. It's by law." The sheriff shook his head. "For that, you need documents, confirmation of their identity, the consent of the authorities. And there is none, Caleb. Without it, I can't leave them. I'll have to." He didn't finish, but the meaning was clear. He would have to arrest them or send them away. At that moment, when it seemed that all was lost, a young woman came out of the crowd. It was Sarah Hollis, the local school teacher, known for her kindness and unorthodox views. Her eyes were full of compassion. "Sheriff, wait," she said. Her voice was clear and resolute. "These women need help. Is the law inhumane?" She turned to the crowd. "Look at these children. They are hungry and scared. Do you want them to die?" The crowd fell silent. Some people lowered their gazes. Sarah's words made them think. Sheriff Brody, seeing the townspeople's hesitation and feeling the public pressure, sighed. "All right, Sarah," he said. "What do you suggest?" Sarah walked up to Caleb. "Mr. Flint, I can help with the documents. I have connections in the state capital. It will take time, but it's possible. And for now, I can take the children in, and we can find temporary shelter for the women. It won't be easy, but it's better than driving them out." Caleb looked at Sarah, then at Nasiva. He saw hope in the old Apache woman's eyes. This woman, who appeared out of nowhere, offered them a chance. It was unexpected. It was intriguing. Again, when everything seemed hopeless, a thin thread of hope appeared. Caleb nodded. "We accept your help, Miss Hollis. Thank you." Staying in Prescott was a real test. The crowd calmed down thanks to the Sheriff Brody's determination and the unexpected intervention of Sarah Hollis, but prejudices did not disappear. Caleb and the women temporarily settled in an old, abandoned shack on the outskirts of town, which Sarah helped them clean up. Caleb's days were filled with trips to the clerk, to the local judge, to officials from the land committee. Every visit was a struggle, every look a condemnation. He felt a deep sadness from the realization how fragile their new hope was in the face of such deep-rooted hatred. The women, at first full of restrained hope, began to lose spirit. Their eyes expressed fatigue and despair. The children's laughter became quieter, as if muffled by the walls of their temporary shelter. Sheriff Brody, although he remained unshakable on matters of law, began to show a certain compassion. He would come to Caleb in the evenings, offering advice, talking about the intricacies of local bureaucracy. "It won't be easy, Flint," he would say, exhaling cigar smoke. "There are many here who believe that Indians belong outside of civilization. But you're different. And these women, I see that they are not ordinary." His words were a balm for Caleb's wounded soul. Sarah Hollis became their true guardian angel. Every day she brought food, clothes, told the children stories and taught them English words. She fought for them in town, explaining to people that these women were not enemies, but victims of circumstances who needed help. Thanks to her efforts, some Prescott residents began to change their attitude, bringing small handouts or offering small jobs for the women, which helped them make ends meet. It was the first breakthrough in public opinion, a thin crack in the wall of prejudice. Meanwhile, Nasiva did not waste time. She used her knowledge to help local residents with their ailments that the town doctors could not cure. Her reputation as a healer began to spread, and soon people began to come to them asking for help. This caused a new wave of intrigue and surprise among the townspeople. How could a savage be so skilled? Some began to see in her not a threat, but a blessing. Finally, after weeks of exhausting struggle, Caleb received news from the clerk. He had obtained permission, not as hired workers, but as wards, which gave them the temporary right to live on Caleb's ranch under his full responsibility. It was not a complete triumph, but a huge breakthrough. It meant they were safe. When Caleb brought this news to the women, their faces lit up with light. The children jumped for joy. It was a relief that washed away months of anxiety and suffering. They would return to the ranch, to their new home that Caleb had created for them. It was the first step towards their new horizon. Returning to the Lone Oak Ranch, Caleb found that it had been transformed. The women, under Nasiva's guidance, had already cleared the thickets, planted a small garden, and built new corrals for the cattle that had finally recovered. The ranch now lived its own new life, filled with women's laughter, children's voices, and the aroma of food cooking over the fire. It was something Caleb had never dared to dream of. One evening, as the sun was setting below the horizon, painting the sky in crimson tones, Caleb sat on the porch, watching the women and children. Ahona was teaching her little ones to sing ancient Apache songs. Chiva, now fully recovered, was weaving a bright rug. Kai and Akal were preparing dinner. Nasiva sat next to him, her wise eyes looking at the sunset. "You are a good man, Caleb," she said quietly. "You found your family." Caleb nodded. He looked at his new family. He, a lonely ranger who had lost everything, now found something much greater. He found not just survival, but meaning. And that was the true triumph. He, a man who once hated Indians, now loved these women and their children as his own. It was an inspiration that changed him forever. His heart, once hardened by grief, now beat fully and freely, filled with love and gratitude. He found not just a new horizon, but a new world. Conclusion and lesson for our viewers. Dear our grandmothers and grandfathers, the story of Caleb Flint and the 5 Apache widows is not just a story about the Wild West. It is a mirror that reflects eternal truths, relevant in our modern world as well. Like Caleb, we often cling to old prejudices, to the way it's always been, afraid to open ourselves to the new, the unknown. We build walls around ourselves, protecting ourselves from pain and loss, but at the same time, we deprive ourselves of the opportunity to find something beautiful. Caleb, faced with a deep personal loss, closed himself off from the world, building barriers of distrust towards those who were different from him. But when life confronted him with an even greater injustice, the suffering of innocent children, his heart faltered. He overcame himself, his pain, and his prejudices. He gave a chance to those whom society had rejected, and in return received much more: a family, a meaning in life, and the healing of his own soul. In our world, where there is so much disagreement, where strangers often seem like a threat, Caleb's story teaches us the power of compassion and openness. It reminds us that true wealth is not in accumulated things or in established orders, but in human connections, in the ability to see a soul in every person, regardless of their origin or appearance, that needs understanding and support. How often do we miss the opportunity to gain something valuable, simply because we are afraid to disrupt the familiar way of life or face difficulties? Caleb's story shows that a true breakthrough begins within ourselves, when we decide to step outside the boundaries of our old ideas. It is not always easy, it is a path full of trials, but at the end of this path, not only relief awaits us, but also an inspiration that can transform our entire life. Remember that each of us is capable of becoming Caleb Flint in our lives, to extend a helping hand, to overcome prejudices, and to find our new family in the most unexpected places. True wisdom comes not with age, but with the readiness to learn, to love, and to accept the world in all its diversity.